Chapter 1. The Affair at Hercule Poirot and the Mystery of the Clock that Skipped Midnight. If ever there was an evening designed to display all the finery of London society, it was the New Year's Eve gala at the Waverley Hotel. The great ballroom, hung with crystal chandeliers like frozen constellations, smelled faintly of roses and expensive cigars. The host, Sir Gerald Albright, had spared nothing. Champagne fountains bubbled like laughter. Musicians murmured a languid waltz in the background. And the famed midnight clock, an ornate timepiece said to have been commissioned by a forgotten duke, stood on a dais, its polished brass face catching the light like a watchful eye. I, Captain Arthur Hastings, had been invited more out of old acquaintance than necessity. Poirot, of course, attended with a certain gravity that contradicted the frivolity around him. He was a small, precise figure, wrapped in a coat cut with geometric exactness. His moustaches, ever the heralds of his moods, twitched with a tension that suggested he perceived undercurrents invisible to others. I confess I attended for the diversion, an evening of sparkle, gossip, and perhaps a bit of the predictable. Until the predictable was bent until it cracked. The clock was the centerpiece, not merely because of its gilded beauty, but because of its odd reputation. The story, which the waiting staff and later certain guests took delight in retelling, was that on the stroke of midnight it had once, decades ago, skipped a beat. A glitch, they said, in the mechanism that had never been properly explained. Tonight, the whisper had that the clock would not only strike 12, but that Sir Gerald had arranged a small private demonstration, a mechanical marvel within the marvel, designed to correct the skip once and for all. The assembled throng, having consumed their hors d'oeuvres and their small talk, gathered close. Poirot, with his characteristic consideration, had positioned himself not in the immediate glare of attention, but a step back, his eyes as sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. "Hastings," he murmured to me, "it is a curious thing, is it not, that the attention of so many is drawn to the clock when time is the very instrument by which secrets are measured and sometimes hidden?" "I had not thought of it," I replied. "But you mean that people hide in plain sight as easily as a hand moves around the face?" "Exactamente. Watch." At precisely 11:59, the host raised his glass. Sir Gerald was a man whose presence suggested mastery over quantities, money, influence, loyalty. His voice, when he spoke, carried without effort, and the room leaned in. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "tonight we do not merely celebrate the passage of hours. We shall witness the correction of a mystery. The Waverley clock will not only chime midnight, it will do so without skipping. I give you the future, polished and punctual. A polite murmur, the kind that pretends the words are weighty, and yet allows the air to remain light. The orchestra's melody faded to a soft murmur as all eyes pivoted toward the clock. Its hands hovered near the 12th mark, the seconds trembling like nerves about to snap. At 20 to 12, I noted a small man in the corner, Miss Eloise Mercer's personal secretary, whispering earnestly to a young woman whose emerald gown cut a severe line in the crowd. The woman, Miss Cressida Lane, daughter of a family newly ennobled and anxious to establish her place, kept glancing toward the clock with a peculiar tightness around her lips. Poirot's glance, quick and unassuming, followed mine and settled there. He raised one tiny finger as if to coax some hidden truth from the air, then inclined his head slightly. "She is watching time, Hastings, not because she is anxious for it to pass, but because she is afraid of what will be revealed when it stays still." Before I could ask him for the meaning of this, the great moment arrived. The room exhaled collectively. The clock's mechanism, hidden behind a glazed panel, whirred with the soft, convincing sounds of careful engineering. The second hand thecked forward. 11:59, 59, then 12. A clear, ringing note rolled out, followed by another, and then, astonishingly, silence. The expected triumphant chime did not come. The brass minute hand trembled, paused, and fell back, as if ashamed. A slight, confused stir, followed by the polite cough of those who would not betray their unease. Sir Gerald's poise for a moment flickered. "Ah," he said, the word too sharp to be called a laugh. "A small, technical irregularity. We shall—" Then came the sound that no one in that glittering room had prepared for, a muffled, abrupt cry from the depths of the inner lounge. A sharp inhale of breath cut off like a snapped thread. It was not the sound of someone tripping, nor the polite gasp of a startled debutante. It was a sound of the body collapsing under some sudden despair. Poirot moved with that quiet certainty which suggested he carried a map of human error in his head. I went with him. We pushed through the cluster of guests, their raised eyebrows and whispered speculations trailing like smoke. Near the back of the lounge, beneath a portrait of a stern-looking ancestor of the Albright family, we found the body. It was Miss Cressida Lane. She lay half-slumped in a velvet chair, her head tilted back, eyes open and blank, a delicate filigree of violet blooming around her throat. Her hand, once clutching a miniature perfume bottle, had fallen to the floor. The bottle itself was smashed, its contents seeping like a slow confession into the polished oak. Around her, the small circle of immediate bystanders, Miss Mercer, the secretary, a physician of the evening's entertainment committee, and Sir Gerald himself, had gathered, eyes wide, voices low. There was no immediate sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no desperate claw marks that would suggest violence. The only thing that did not fit calmly into that quiet tableau was the small, ivory-handled pocket watch that lay on the ground near her other hand. Its face stopped at exactly 12. Poirot crouched, peering with those black, observant eyes. He picked up the perfume stopper with a gloved finger, not so much as touching it, and held it between his peculiar fingers. "Ah, mon Dieu," he murmured, softly, so that only I heard. "The clock has not simply skipped midnight, it has given us a pause. Very curious." He turned his head toward the stopped pocket watch. "And this keeps faithful time, but the time it shows is not the time of death. No, Hastings, the little grey cells will tell us the difference." Chapter 2. The First Clues. The murmurs rippled like a disturbed pond, polite on the surface but trembling beneath. Sir Gerald, with a measured calm that now seemed rehearsed, insisted the physician, Dr. Fenton, examine Miss Cressida at once. The doctor, a lean man with spectacles perched precariously on the bridge of his nose, bent over her with a practiced hand. Poirot, meanwhile, remained a quiet presence just behind, his little grey cells working with the methodical precision of a clockmaker inspecting a mechanism. "She is gone," Dr. Fenton announced, his tone careful, as though weighing the words before releasing them. "No outward marks of violence, no hemorrhaging, the eyes are fixed, the violet discoloration." He paused, glancing at Poirot with something like a question, which the detective returned with an inscrutable tilt. It could indicate asphyxiation, perhaps an allergic reaction. The perfume, if it were not broken, might give us some clue. "Ah," Poirot said softly, "but we must not be carried away by the appearance of the flower before asking if it is truly the one that blossomed here." He lifted his head, and his gaze moved over the small circle around the chair, Miss Eloise Mercer, with her hands clasped too tightly, the secretary, Mr. Latham, standing as if holding himself too straight, Sir Gerald's jaw working beneath his composed facade, and a young footman frozen at the edge of the group. Hastings, who had followed Poirot's attention without quite understanding its direction, leaned toward me. "You think the violet is perhaps not the cause?" "Non, mon ami. The color is a consequence. The reason is elsewhere." Poirot's fingers, delicate and deliberate, moved to the pocket watch. He turned it slightly. "This is well wound, n'est-ce pas?" and yet it stopped at a precise moment. The mechanism does not fail like that without intention or a sudden removal of the hand that regulates it. He tapped the face gently with the tip of his nail. We shall see why it is important that she had this timepiece. There is a message in its stillness. I knelt and observed the broken perfume bottle. The scent that lingered was faint. Nowhere near the sharp, florid bouquet one would expect from Miss Cressida's favored violet essence. It was a thin, almost medicinal tang beneath it, like a ghost of something purer. Poirot sniffed it, not dramatically, but with a barely perceptible inhale of his delicate nostrils. He said. The fragrance has been adulterated or has changed. Perhaps it was not her usual. Or perhaps the bottle is a diversion. Diversion from what? I whispered. Before Poirot could answer, a sharp, whispered voice came from the doorway. It was a maid, young and trembling, her apron pressed to her chest. "Captain Hastings," she said. I saw Miss Lane earlier, speaking with Lord Bertram. They were near the conservatory. She seemed agitated, and he was talking very low." She glanced at Poirot. "He left quickly when the clock was being prepared. He looked upset." Poirot's small grey eyes flicked to the distant corner where Lord Bertram, an elderly aristocrat with icy composure and a set of reflective spectacles, stood removed, his gloved hands folded like a question. "Thank you," Poirot said to the maid, his voice gentler than the suspicion it carried. "You have been most observant." Lord Bertram, approached with caution, spoke with the cool authority of a man accustomed to being believed. "I met Miss Lane briefly," he said. "She spoke of the clock, how she feared something would go wrong. I offered reassurance, that was all. I left because the demonstration was about to begin, and I did not wish to be in the way." "And you, Lord Bertram?" Poirot inquired. "Were the one who suggested the presence of the private correction?" "I had an opinion, yes. I have, after all, been interested in mechanical curiosities for decades. But my interest is purely academic." Poirot's eyes drifted, ever so slightly, to the portrait above the lounge, its painted ancestor staring down with a blind permanence as if judging the living by the sins of the dead. He turned back to the group. "Hastings, note the position of the body. The chair is not disturbed. She did not fall from sudden convulsion. She was seated, perhaps leaning, and something overcame her slowly enough to allow the hand to relax around the miniature bottle. There was time to reach for something, and yet the watch is not in the hand. It has fallen. And here," he added, pointing to the edge of the polished oak, "a small smear." I bent closer. There, faint and almost invisible unless one looked with intention, was a print, smudged as if the hand that left it had hesitated. Not a violent mark, but a trace, like a thought imprinted and partially erased. "A fingerprint?" I asked. Poirot smiled, very small. "Mais oui, but it is a partial. Someone came close and then retreated. Or perhaps someone touched something they wished to suggest they had not. The little grey cells appreciate the hesitation. It belongs to no one in this immediate circle, unless, of course, one of them has clean fingers now and did not before." Miss Mercer, at that moment, let out a soft sound, not a gasp, but a constriction of breath, and her hands, once clasped, trembled. I was arranging the guest list," she stammered. "I didn't touch anything near her. I only spoke to her about the upcoming toast." Poirot's eyebrows imperceptibly lifted. "And yet, mademoiselle, your hands are clean to the touch. That is not unusual in society. But your pulse—" He placed a slender fingertip briefly near her wrist, then withdrew. "You're telling me the truth about that. Good. We shall keep it in mind." Mr. Latham, the secretary, who had until now stood with his face composed, spoke abruptly. Miss Lane requested a private word with Sir Gerald. He refused, saying the demonstration had to proceed. She was frustrated. She asked me to relay a message about the clock's correction. but I was engaged with other duties." His gaze flicked toward Sir Gerald, who, for his part, seemed to have resumed his role as host with a forced ease. "This clock," Poirot said, "was meant to correct an old irregularity. Miss Lane feared it would fail again. She spoke to Lord Bertram, she asked for a moment with Sir Gerald, and when it failed, she's found quietly in this chair. The watch, the altered perfume, the hesitation of a hand, these are like threads. We will draw them carefully, one by one, to see where the pattern emerges. But let us keep our eyes on the apparent. The irregularity of the clock was the invitation. The true irregularity is here." He touched the edge of the chair, his fingers barely brushing the velvet. "We have time, no? It is even now in the pause, and the pause has given us a question." The question hung, taut in the air, as the assembled guests and attendants, unaware of the larger pattern Poirot had begun to sketch in his mind, began to murmur once more, this time with a cautious, uncertain undertone. Chapter 3. The Gathering of Suspects. The lounge, which minutes before had glittered in its polished composure, now held a quieter, more brittle air. The body of Miss Cressida Lane had been carried discreetly behind a velvet screen, and the guests had been shepherded, not by force, but by the gravity of unspoken questions, into the adjacent drawing-room. Sir Gerald, beneath his cultivated calm, had appointed Dr. Fenton to remain near the body and instructed the staff to limit movement. Poirot, his expression composed as always, did not permit the evening to dissolve into hysteria. Instead, he turned the moment into order, as though shaping a pattern from scattered pieces. "Now," he said, "we shall know who is near and who is distant. Bring them, Hastings. We must speak with each, gently, yes, but directly. The little grey cells prefer to hear the same story told in several voices. Contradiction is a kind of light. We must see where it shines differently." The first to be drawn into the inner circle was Sir Gerald himself. He was a man of middle age, with the sort of lined hands that suggested command over ledgers and loyalties. His wealth was visible in the cut of his coat, in the way he moved without apology through the room. But tonight there was something else. A tension in the set of his shoulders, a slight widening of the eyes when his name was spoken. Poirot observed him with the circumspection of one testing a delicate mechanism. "I am distressed," Sir Gerald said, not as an apology, but as an assertion that he was entitled to be so. "Miss Lane, she had a future, Hastings. She was newly introduced, yes, but she had the ambition of those who know the taste of high things. The clock was to have been a spectacle. Now, this." He paused, then added with a brittle control, "I had no reason to wish her ill." "Ah," Poirot replied. "And yet you arranged the demonstration. You placed importance upon its success." "My reputation, mon cher, is built on the extraordinary. Failure is inconvenient." He straightened. "But inconvenience does not kill." Next came Lord Bertram. His composure was a thin, almost crystalline mask. The aristocratic self-possession hid something deeper, a cool appraisal of consequence. He had been a friend of the Albrights for years, a man whose opinions about mechanical marvels were sought by collectors and institutions. His spectacles caught the light as he tilted his head, and the edges of his voice carried the insinuation that he believed himself above the general dance of guilt. "Miss Lane was nervous," he offered, as if dropping a fact and not a suspicion. "She feared that the correction would fail. She spoke of the past skipping as though it were a prophecy. I told her that the past was immutable, that the presence of error does not necessarily foretell doom. She left soon after. I returned to the group to observe the correction attempt. When it failed, the air itself seemed to tremble." "And you did not follow her?" Poirot asked, the way one inquires about the movement of a piece on a chessboard. "I did not. I'm not in the habit of chasing ghosts." He glanced briefly toward the portrait of the Albright ancestor, then back, as if assuring himself that his reflection would not betray him. Miss Eloise Mercer was brought forward with the hesitance of someone who had not expected to be suddenly central. Tall, with a social grace that had been honed like a weapon, she wore soft shades that emphasized the blue of her eyes. Her backstory was known to many. The daughter of a minor industrialist who had recently purchased a title, she had been keen to establish her circle among old families. Her demeanor now was taut, under the surface of cultivated control. She radiated a weary vigilance. "I only wished to ensure the guest list was correct," she said quickly, hands folded in a gesture that was practiced but not entirely successful in hiding her agitation. Miss Lane and I had spoken of introductions. She had asked about Sir Gerald's intentions for the clock, and I assured her that the demonstration would proceed without trouble. I saw her near Lord Bertram. She seemed unsettled. That was all. "Unsettled how?" Poirot asked smoothly. She was whispering. She kept looking at the clock, then away, like someone who feared someone would look back. Her mouth twitched. "It is a foolish thing to be afraid of time, is it not?" "Time is very clever," Poirot murmured. "It hides many things by simple movement." Mr. Latham, the secretary, had a different cadence. He was younger, with a precise inflection in his speech that betrayed a life spent recording, never committing. He had been responsible for notes, messages, the small machinery of communication that kept social gears moving. "Miss Lane asked me to pass along a request to Sir Gerald," he said. "She wished for a private moment to speak with him. I was delayed. There were several pressing matters, invitations to confirm, and then the demonstration began. I did not see her again until the moment of failure. His voice wavered, a rare fissure of uncertainty. "I should have made it clearer. She seemed desperate." "Desperate for what?" I asked. "Because someone had to put words to the watermarks of tension. To be heard." He swallowed. "She kept saying it would not be as it seemed, that the correction might reveal more than time itself." The undercurrent of all these voices was not yet accusation. It was layering, each detail a stroke in a painting not yet complete. Poirot listened and then allowed the others to approach. There was the hotel manager, an efficient woman with a sharp collar and sharper eyes, who confirmed the schedule of movements and rehearsals. There was the young footman, quiet and inexperienced, who testified to having delivered the correction mechanism's private notes and having seen Miss Lane standing near the clock, speaking to no one. And then a softer figure arrived unbidden, Mrs. Ada Forsyth, a widowed patron of the arts, whose friendship with Sir Gerald was both financial and theatrical. She had been near the balcony, watching the scene with a kind of detached interest. "She and I spoke briefly," she said of Miss Lane. She had a way of looking at people as if trying to read the space behind their words. She asked me very quietly if I believed in coincidence. I told her that too many coincidences had the shape of intention. She nodded and then left to speak with Lord Bertram. Poirot's fingers steepled, not in gesture but in quiet contemplation. The circle was now closed enough to begin to feel its edges. "We have," he observed, "a clock that failed, a young woman who feared a revelation, a request that was not heeded in time, and the suggestion of something hidden behind what is seen. Each of you has a relationship with the moment before the failure. That is not a crime, yet. It is the geography of possibility, but from geography one begins to trace paths. We are not yet at the end of our map." Chapter 4. Poirot arrives. It is not that Poirot had not been seen before. It is that his presence now became a fulcrum. Up until this moment, I had thought of him as companion, observer, amusing commentator, until the way he shifted the room made me feel as if the air itself were rearranging to accommodate a new axis. He had been quiet in the earlier questioning, drawing out details like a jeweler testing a stone. Now he stepped fully into the light, not with theatricality, but as one who brings a lens to focus what was previously blurred. He began with the official theory. spoken with that gentle precision which bends belief without breaking it. "It is natural," he said, "that one would look to the failure of the clock as cause. The mechanism, after all, did not perform as declared. The failure unsettled the room, and in unsettling, it gave courage to the shadow of fear to move." He turned, his gaze taking in Sir Gerald's tightened control, Lord Bertram's cool distance, Miss Mercer's forced calm, Mr. Latham's residual guilt, and the others with the quiet poise of a man noting the shape of voices as much as their content. "But tell me, Monsieur Albright," he added, addressing Sir Gerald directly, "at what moment did you first notice Miss Lane's agitation before the correction attempt?" Sir Gerald, who had seemed composed under pressure, now showed the faintest fracture of confusion. She was near Lord Bertram. She spoke of the past. "I thought she was simply nervous, as one is before an important moment." "I did not consider it a harbinger." "Of course you did not," Poirot said, and there was no sarcasm, merely the quiet implication that ignoring a small thing when larger things loom is the most common mistake of all. "And you, Lord Bertram, you did not follow her because you do not chase shadows." Admirable. And yet shadows sometimes carry messages. He let the silence rest a heartbeat before continuing. "You all were in a dance with time. The clock failed. A woman who feared something unseen is found dead. The very nature of the failure becomes the chorus, and yet the melody is different." He turned to the hotel manager. "Madame, you coordinate movement. Were there any unusual instructions given regarding those who could approach the clock, or any changes in the rehearsal that would have allowed someone to be close to Miss Lane, or the mechanism, without drawing attention?" She answered crisply. "The correction sequence was rehearsed twice. Only authorized staff were meant to be within arm's length. No one was to interfere. Miss Lane was not part of the technical rehearsals. She had asked to see the inner workings, but was politely declined. After that, she spoke to Lord Bertram and, briefly, to Miss Mercer. There was nothing else. The only unusual request was to speak privately with Sir Gerald, which was not fulfilled before the demonstration. Poirot nodded slowly, and his fingers, as ever, moved not with haste, but with the assurance of one who knows that movement can unsettle the wrong thing. "Hastings," he murmured under his breath, "see how they speak of proximity as if it were a shield. They bring forward the visible to hide the invisible." I, faithful chronicler, could not help but note that Poirot's entrance had altered the dynamics. Before him, their stories were isolated islands. With him, the gaps between them began to look like rivers, and the currents in those rivers might carry something unseen. I asked aloud, because sometimes the simplest question loosens a hinge. "Poirot, do you believe the failure of the clock was deliberate? Or is the failure itself a stage, and something else the play?" He inclined his head, the moustaches twitching in a manner that suggested both pleasure and calculation. "The stage is too neat for accident, Hastings. The failure is not the murder. It is the distraction. The death of Miss Lane is not in the loud crack of broken machinery. It is in the silent pause after expectation. The official theory, which is that the clock's correction caused a panic that led to her collapse, is comfortable. Comfort disguises injustice." "Then someone wanted us to look at the clock," I said. "Ah," Poirot's eyes brightened. "To look is to be blind, my friend. When one stares, one fails to see what moves just at the edge." The person who arranged for the demonstration, who had interest in its success or its failure, had also interest in the attention being caught, like a net thrown over fish. We must ask, what would a failure allow someone to do unnoticed, and what would a pause in time allow one to shift? He turned again to the small group. "The authorities will want to close this quickly. They will gather the obvious. They will congratulate themselves on catching the easiest thread. But before anyone declares a conclusion, I wish to speak with each of you again, alone, if you will consent." Small contradictions, small adjustments in the story, these are not lies. They are the geography of the truth. One does not need force to catch a lie. One needs attention to the manner in which it is given. The official investigator, a Superintendent Wilkes from Scotland Yard, who had until then remained in the background with the deference due to a gathering of the polite elite, now stepped forward with a gravity of career. He had already begun to formulate a tidy line. Mechanical failure. The shock of it, a nervous collapse made fatal by an underlying condition, perhaps exacerbated by something near her throat. Poirot allowed him his moment, nodded as if conceding the possibility, but the way his eyes shifted, not away from Wilkes, but around him, told me that Poirot had placed the man not as an adversary, but as a loose piece to be gently adjusted. "I shall," Poirot said to Wilkes, "offer you the conclusion when the map is complete. For now, permit me the courtesy of asking questions before your certainty solidifies." The superintendent, slightly disarmed by the directness, yet appreciative of the method, agreed with a curt nod. Poirot's manner did not yet reveal what he believed. He simply set the tempo. He had, subtly, suggested that the theory of accident was too tidy, that the failure had been used as an armature upon which something else was built, that Miss Lane's fear before midnight was a signal, and her request denied a key. He had also, with a light touch, made clear that he would be speaking with each of them again, and that their stories would be held like notes in a concerto, played separately, then together until the dissonance resolved into a single, undeniable chord. As the guests dispersed, the evening's earlier laughter now dulled into cautious silence, Poirot turned to me with a small smile that was not quite a comfort. "Hastings," he said, "we have begun, The game is not yet of accusation. It is of observation. The murderer, if murderer there is, has placed a piece at the center and expects the others to arrange themselves around it. We will not. We shall instead look at the spaces between."
Chapter 5. Initial Interviews. Poirot's method was quiet, insistent.
Like a gentle current that eventually turns the largest stone. He preferred to begin in the small rooms off the main salon, where voices would not carry and the pretense of casual conversation could hide the sharpening of questions. Hastings and I sat in the library, its heavy drapes drawn to soften the glare from the chandeliers beyond, while Poirot summoned his first interviewee, Miss Eloise Mercer. She arrived with a practiced smile that had already lost some of its earlier sheen. Poirot offered her a chair, not opposite but slightly to the side, so that she had the sensation of being seen from a perspective that allowed no easy evasion. He kept his hands folded, his posture relaxed in appearance only. "Mademoiselle," he began, in that cadence which soothed while probing, "you are the one who organized the introductions. You're also one with a keen eye for the positioning of people, yes?" "I believe in society having order," she answered, the words measured. "It gives structure to possibility. Her eyes slid, just for a heartbeat, toward the small table where the portable observer clock from the corner of the room ticked softly, then away. Miss Lane was nervous. She had asked whether the correction would be perfect. I told her that all things could be polished, even faults, with enough attention. "And did she say why she feared imperfection?" Poirot asked, voice light. "She spoke in riddles. That is the truth. She kept saying that a change in rhythm reveals the heartbeat beneath." She stopped, searching his face. It sounded like a fanciful way of saying she suspected something underlying the success of the demonstration. Poirot tapped his fingertips together, barely. "And did she mention anyone specifically?" "No, she only mentioned time being a liar. I thought her poetic." Her lips tightened. "She also asked if you, Monsieur Poirot, would attend. She admired your reputation for finding truth in small things." "I see." Poirot's eyes did not leave her. "You are pleased by reputation, yes? It confirms your own choices." "I am not blind to convenience," she said dryly. "But I am surprised the demonstration has unearthed such complexity." She gave a brief, brittle laugh. "People have their secrets. That is not new. After she left, Poirot turned to me. "She has a nice habit," he murmured, "of defining the perimeter of her territory with words. She wishes to appear above suspicion by making it appear that everything, including surprise, was anticipated. That is a tactic of placement, placing herself as the center of an ordered world, while surrounding her with the suggestion that she is merely an observer. Watch her in the larger picture. She will show calm, yes, but a small tremor in the edge of control reveals where she fears the ground might shift. Next, Lord Bertram, who arrived in a slow, considered stride. Poirot did not offer him the softer light of the library. Instead, he escorted the elderly gentleman to a small study adjacent, where a heavy globe sat, and the window looked out over the hotel's courtyard. "Lord Bertram," Poirot began, "you are a gentleman who has seen many mechanical marvels. You are also a man accustomed to being above the need to discover. Tell me, why did you not follow Miss Lane when she left you?" "Because I did not wish to appear inquisitive where it would look like suspicion," Lord Bertram replied, with the fainted edge of a man who believed appearance was nearly identical to truth. "And because I did not believe her fear was grounded. She spoke of prophecy, and I have no patience for mysteries dressed in superstition." "Ah," Poirot said, "you believe in the shape of things, and not necessarily the movement beneath them. You did not pursue her. That is, perhaps, because you are content to let things reveal themselves by inertia, rather than by interrogation." "I do not chase shadows," Lord Bertram answered. "They dissipate under light." "Yet," Poirot observed, "you saw agitation, and you turned your back. That is the moment a man can choose whether to lean forward or withdraw. You withdrew. Curiously, it is in withdrawal that one sometimes reveals more than in pursuit. We shall keep that. Non." Lord Bertram gave a faint incline of the head, and his thin lips curved in something that was not quite a smile. Mr. Latham's interview followed. He was more nervous than before, his notes now a private weight. Poirot had him sit, and, in a deliberate twist, offered him a slip of paper and a pencil, as if to make him feel at ease with the simple act of writing while speaking. "You said Miss Lane wished to speak with Sir Gerald," Poirot began. "Did she tell you why it was urgent?" She kept saying the correction would show the truth," Mr. Latham stammered, "that it had to be known before midnight, or the pause would hide it. She was fearful that what was in the mechanism was not merely a mechanical issue. She believed the failure was a kind of curtain, and that behind it something might be rearranged." "And you delayed?" "I had other documents. I intended to deliver her request. I did not think it would be so immediate." His hand twitched as he held the pencil. She was sincere. I believed her. That is why I feel guilty. If I had gone sooner, perhaps, Poirot murmured. "Guilt is an expensive coat. One wears it believing it will cloak responsibility. We shall see whether the warmth is deserved." As the interviews continued, Mrs. Ada Forsyth, cool and observant, refusing to be accused of indulging in coincidence. The hotel manager, precise to the edge of defensive. Even the footman, whose nervous report of moving messages and seeing Miss Lane object with the correction schedule gave a small functional coloring. Poirot's questions were always the same shape. Gentle, narrow, designed to prompt a revealing slip, a hesitation, a rephrasing. He did not accuse. He collected. I found myself increasingly aware of the quiet spaces between answers. That was where he lingered, waiting for the next person to fill them, not with explanation, but with a contrast. His mind was arranging contradictory colors on a palette, not mixing them yet, but holding each so the difference could be seen clearly when the time came to blend. As the hour moved on, the interviews would fold into a pattern. For now, they were brushstrokes. Individual, careful, not yet forming the whole. Poirot, when he finally paused, looked at me with those small bright eyes. "The first layer is laid. Hastings, we have texture. That's good. It will allow us to see where the paint has been applied, twice. Chapter 6. First, false lead. The tide of the evening shifted, not with a dramatic wave, but like the almost imperceptible sliding of a curtain. The information gathered had given shape to suspicion, but nothing had yet been confirmed. That changed, abruptly, and with a kind of eager certainty, when Superintendent Wilkes emerged from his temporary seclusion and announced that he had a candidate for explanation. A neat, comfortable conclusion that made eyes brighten and shoulders relax. The evidence, as it was presented, had an air of inevitability. Mr. Latham, the secretary, had been seen by the young footman with whom he had spoken on the corridor near the private study, carrying a small wrapped parcel in the minutes prior to the demonstration. The parcel, according to the footman's recollection, had the same dimensions as the miniature perfume bottle, and when questioned, Latham had been unable at first to recall whether he had passed anything to Miss Lane that evening. Then came the discovery in the pocket of his coat, a crumpled note, half smudged, with the phrase, "Before it strikes, tell him," scrawled in a hurried hand, the ink smeared as if by trembling. Coupled with the fact that Miss Lane had been seen arguing with him earlier about her request, it painted a picture pleasingly simple. A message misdelivered, a desperate woman, a panicked secretary who failed to act, and a collapse that followed a failure of communication. Wilkes, with the satisfaction of a man who had plucked the lowest-hanging fruit, declared before the assembled few, Mr. Latham's negligence created the environment in which Miss Lane's fear became fatal. He withheld her urgent request, and therefore he is the one whose hesitance, in effect, caused the sequence. He had proximity, motive to protect his own station, and the note reveals that there was something urgent she wished conveyed. If the timeline holds, one can argue this neglect is the first domino. Mr. Latham stood pale but erect, his hands clasped as if in supplication. "I did not," he began. Then, seeing the sharp, accusing eyes of certain guests, he faltered. "I had other tasks. I did not think the moment would come so soon." She did not specify what she meant. "I intended to deliver it. I did not wish harm." "Negligence," Wilkes said with the quiet crush of finality, "is a form of moral failing, Mr. Latham. It is not murder, but it allowed the sequence to proceed unchecked. I'm placing you under informal supervision while we finalize this. The public will want closure, and you provide the first ready figure." The room, previously humid with uncertainty, exhaled an institutional relief. Miss Mercer, who had been watching with an intent that wore the sheen of satisfaction, relaxed as if a weight had settled into something more manageable. Lord Bertram, too, gave a thin nod, the implication being that the official line now had a shape. Someone had erred, and the error was enough to explain the tragedy. Poirot, however, remained quiet. He let the murmur rise, the congratulations that were not yet deserved gather. And then, with his small, precise voice, he asked, "Monsieur Latham, may I see the note?" The superintendent, taken aback by the interruption to his tidy method, hesitated, but the note was produced. Poirot held it, tilting it just so, and let the light play across the ink. "Before it strikes, tell him." He looked up. "Who is him?" Mr. Latham swallowed. She meant Sir Gerald. She believed the correction would show something about the lineage, perhaps, or the influence of the family. "I don't know." She left before she could explain. "Ah." Poirot placed the paper down gently. "And why, mon ami, would she instruct you in such a vague manner if it were urgent? She could have said, 'Tell Sir Gerald that the adjustment must not proceed,' or 'Warn him of the pause.' Instead, she asked you to say something incomplete. That is the mark of someone who does not wish to be direct, or someone who had been interrupted mid-thought." His little grey eyes moved over the gathered faces. "The negligence story is tidy. It is like a straight line drawn where the true path may curve around a hidden stone." Wilkes, sensing resistance but not yet the shape of it, pressed. You are suggesting the note is not relevant to the failure? I'm suggesting, Superintendent, Poirot said, smiling slightly, that it is not sufficient to make a man guilty when the possible guilt is wrapped in the shadow of the obvious. Mr. Latham delayed. That is true. He is not a murderer in the evidence currently presented. He is someone who might feel shame for having been too slow. That is different from the one who prepared the stage. The gravity of the first false lead had settled in the room. The idea that the case could be wrapped around negligence was comforting because it required no deeper excavation. The guests began to murmur again, some in pity, some in quiet discussion about how easily the machinery of human error could be turned into tragedy. Poirot, turning to me as the whispering tide rose, simply said, "They will celebrate capturing the simplest shadow, Hastings. The real light is elsewhere. The first false lead serves to make the true one hungry. We must allow them their satisfaction briefly. It will make their attention softer when the next movement begins." Chapter 7. The Psychological Game. The official satisfaction with Mr. Latham's error hung in the air like a drugged calm. People allowed themselves to believe that the tide had been arrested, that the current had a visible dam. It was in that softening of attention that Poirot began to play his game, not with accusation, but with suggestion, with carefully placed discomforts that had the effect of making the guilty shift in their chairs and the innocent tighten their grip on composure. He began with the simplest of devices, returning to the scene with small, almost innocuous references. "To Miss Mercer," he remarked casually. "You admired order, did you not? And yet, mademoiselle, when something you arrange walks slightly off the path, do you feel the need to adjust it or to observe who made the step wrong?" Her smile, when it came, had a crack in it. "I observe," she said lightly. "Sometimes the path is wrong, not the walker." Poirot's eyes lingered a fraction longer on the slight tremor in her fingers. "Interesting. The difference between seeing and correcting is what distinguishes those who control from those who merely participate." To Lord Bertram, he offered a comment about inertia. "You spoke earlier of shadows dissipating under light. Yet when a shadow stretches, one can ask whether the light has shifted, or whether the object has moved in secret." Bertram's reply was measured, and yet one could see the internal calculation, should he take offense or interpret the remark as idle philosophy. He chose the latter, but the tiny contraction around his mouth was a tell of something unsettled. Poirot saved the most deliberate of his maneuvers for the gathering where the circle could not easily tighten. A small informal tea in the private parlour where he invited Sir Gerald, Mrs. Forsyth, and a reluctant Mr. Latham under the pretense of clarifying timelines. The tea was poured, delicate cups clinked. Poirot, with his habitual attention to the placement of sugar cubes, allowed each person's comment to land and then subtly shifted the topic. "To understand why a thing appears obvious," he said, "one must first understand what everyone expected. Sir Gerald, you wished for the correction to succeed publicly. Mrs. Forsyth, you observed coincidences and suggested intention. Mr. Latham, you felt the weight of a request. All of you had a part in the moment the clock failed. But tell me, who among you felt the pause as relief, and who felt it as a threat?" Sir Gerald's hand tightened around his teacup. "Relief," he answered swiftly, then caught himself and added, "and concern. A failure is a blemish, yes, but it is also a story. It could shift perceptions." Mrs. Forsyth's expression did not change. I felt curiosity. It is the natural reaction of one who observes the fold in what is expected. The pause reveals more than the resolution. Her eyes briefly flicked toward Sir Gerald, then to Latham, before returning to Poirot. "I have known many who wish to control outcomes. They forget that unpredictability reveals character." Poirot turned to Latham, who was visibly shrinking. "You, monsieur, the pause made you believe the message had been heard. Perhaps in that belief you absolved yourself, That is human, but the one who causes a pause and intends behind it has a different breathing. Did you notice, before the announcement of your error, any change in the atmosphere, in the body language of those around you, that was not speech but suggestion? Latham stared, the pencil in his hand forgotten. I noticed Miss Lane speak to Mrs. Forsyth. She was quiet, but her eyes—" He stopped, as if stopped by something in himself. "She said that the truth sometimes arrives in silence, and that one must listen to the unsaid. I took it to mean she did not wish to alarm anyone. I was wrong." Poirot nodded slowly. She spoke of silence. And yet her own fear made noise in the corners. That is the tension. One who wishes to hide moves quietly, but the one who fears to be unseen trembles in the stillness. The little grey cells like the contrast. He then angled his conversation so the implications settled around Sir Gerald in a gentle but unmistakable way. "You wished the correction to be public. A public success bathes one in light. A failure, even if inconvenient, draws a different kind of attention. Which is more dangerous, we? The one that is too brilliant, or the one that is quietly disruptive?" Sir Gerald's jaw worked. "I seek order. A failure, even a small one, invites speculation." "And speculation," Poirot continued, "is the first seed of narrative. You understand that stories frame moralities. We all create stories to cleanse ourselves of discomfort. Some of us, however, create stories to make others carry the discomfort for us. That is the difference between a host and a manipulator. You are both tonight." The remark hung like a feathered arrow, delicate and precise. Sir Gerald did not respond with heat. He responded with a tightened courtesy. Mrs. Forsyth's eyes, sharp and assessing, did not soften. Mr. Latham, caught between shame and relief, simply nodded, as if to signal agreement with the weight he understood but did not yet have language to challenge. Poirot's game was not accusation. He was not forcing a confession. What he was doing was unsettling the internal equilibria so that when the true culprit moved next, the reaction would be visible, not as sudden, but as a misstep in balance. He had already noted reactions, the too quick relief at the false lead, the subtle tightening of posture when certain phrases were used, the casual philosophical withdrawal of Lord Bertram when the conversation edged toward motive. Before dismissing the small group, he added, with a faint lift of his moustaches, "We shall speak again. The one who is close to breaking will not know it is the game. They will believe they are safe because the first conclusion has been embraced. That is when the truth, which hides behind comfortable narratives, will show the crack." As they left, Mrs. Forsyth paused near the doorway. "You play with their minds, Monsieur Poirot," she said, half in observation and half in warning. "I do not play," he replied smoothly. "I merely make them see their own reflections." The mirror is sometimes more terrifying than the accusation. His gaze drifted to me. "Hastings, the player thinks the board is set. We shall observe who moves when they believe no one is watching." Chapter 8. A Secondary Mystery. The evening, which had been narrowing itself into the thin corridor between the false lead and the deeper truth, widened again in a manner that carried the scent of deliberate distraction. It was Mrs. Ada Forsyth who brought it, not with a shriek or a dramatic entrance, but with the quiet precision of someone locating a dissonant note in a symphony and pointing to it without alarm. "I believe," she announced to Poirot and me in the hallway outside the library, "that someone has taken from my sitting room a letter that was not meant to be seen by most. It was in the green box on the writing desk. I came to retrieve it and found the box open, the letter missing." "A letter?" Poirot's expression, previously composed, sharpened subtly. "From whom to whom?" Mrs. Forsyth lifted her chin with a careful elegance. "From a benefactor to me. One who has long provided support to the hospital wing at St. Heliers. It contained, in coded form, references to the arrangement of certain financial gifts and something more. I had not intended to show it tonight. It concerned a matter of debt, yes, but also the name of someone who had previously requested discretion regarding an inheritance. It was personal. Its absence is curious. You did not show it to anyone? I asked. No, I placed it there this afternoon after reading it. I intended to write a reply. The box was locked. The lock is simple. It requires only a slight pressure to open, but the contents remain secure to casual passing hands. Only those who knew its location could have done this without creating a scene. Poirot, folding his hands, looked toward the drawing room where the earlier interviews continued in low hum. A letter removed? Mademoiselle, is a message interrupted. It is also a companion to silence. The first story told us of a pause. Now, someone has sought to remove another voice. Who would benefit from suppressing what was written there? Mrs. Forsyth's eyes narrowed in a way that suggested she had already wondered the same thing. It is, perhaps, related to what Miss Lane feared would be seen in the correction. The letter mentioned, indirectly, a lineage question and a promise made in confidence. If the letter were to come to light, it could change how certain alliances appear. It could show intention where there was assumed benevolence. Poirot inclined his head. We shall treat it, then, as an event and not a coincidence. Hastings, perhaps you would be so kind as to see that Mrs. Forsyth's sitting room is secured. I would like to examine the desk. The thief, if there is one, has left a quiet signature. The removal was not violent. There would be no rush and no clatter. It was a deliberate choice to take and vanish, like a shadow lifting a veil. I went ahead to the room, finding the small salon lined with books, the writing desk against the wall beneath the portrait of a young woman in soft pastels. The green box sat open, the velvet inside showing the indent where the letter had rested. There was nothing else disturbed. On the underside of the lid, a faint smear, perhaps from a thumb, showed a trace that was too faint to be accidental. A folded scrap of paper lay near the edge of the desk, a small torn corner, as if someone had been interrupted mid-use of a blotter. Poirot arrived and sat lightly, peering. He ran a gloved fingertip near the indentation without touching the interior directly, as one who listens to a silence. Someone knew where to look, he said. The removal is recent. There is no dust, no desperation. They had a moment, two perhaps, and the letter was taken. The corner scrap is useful. It was used as a buffer or to smear, perhaps to test ink. It bears a partial impression. We shall have Miss Forsyth show me the code key when she is willing. In the meantime, we will consider who has interest in the modification of reputations. Mrs. Forsyth, watching him, added quietly, there were conversations tonight of control, of narrative. The pause of the clock gave a story. The missing letter removes another. Someone is trying to shape not only what is seen, but what can be revealed after the fact. And Miss Lane, Poirot mused, who feared the correction would show something. She had asked questions about lineage. She had spoken with you, yes? We spoke briefly, Mrs. Forsyth admitted. She noted the subtleties of those who hide behind generosity, and she mentioned a name, one connected to the very grant in the letter. She thought that perhaps the correction, if successful, would make visible the influence behind it. She believed the past irregularity belonged to something deeper than mechanics. Poirot's eyes, small and alert, shifted. So the original pause, caused by the clock, the death of the woman who feared a revelation, and now the theft of a letter revealing intentions. These are not separate notes. They play together. The thief took something that, if exposed, could force a reconsideration of many things. The pause and the theft are both acts of silence, one imposed by mechanical distraction, the other by removal. Who among the circle gains if one voice is delayed and another is silenced? Mrs. Forsyth's gaze traveled over the portrait of the Albright ancestor, then to the hall where the others moved, unaware that a second mystery had been introduced to anchor their assumptions more firmly. You think the theft was meant to assist the muddled theory about the negligence? she said softly. Perhaps, Poirot replied, or to provide a new layer of confusion. A second mystery is the best companion for a first false certainty. It asks the mind to open a second door while believing the first is closed. We will keep this. We shall not speak of it widely until we have seen who benefits most from its silence. He turned to me. Hastings, the map has another point. We may need to widen the circle again. The murderer does not wish to be hurried. They prefer that others chase the sounds they create, while the true intention moves quietly behind. Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. The secondary disruption, the missing letter, had the effect of a soft tremor beneath the surface. It made people hesitate before speaking, as though the ground might shift again. Poirot, who had placed the new mystery alongside the old without announcing it to the wider company, used the unease to pry deeper into relationships that had previously appeared tidy. What had seemed like separate lines of association now, under the quiet weight of observation, began to knot. He began with Mrs. Ada Forsyth. The conversation took place in the conservatory, its glass panes misted with the distant chill of the night air, while the scent of camellias softened the edges of the room. Poirot leaned slightly forward, fingers interlaced. You are connected to many things, mademoiselle. Your patronage is not merely financial. It is an influence. Tell me about your history with Sir Gerald. Mrs. Forsyth smiled, a practiced smile, the one that suggested mysteries she would not surrender easily. We have been companions in philanthropy and spectacle for years. He gives me gatherings. I give him purpose. It is a mutual arrangement. I've also known Lord Bertram socially. He provides opinion when one wishes to dress generosity in tradition. Her eyes flicked casually toward a small framed photograph on the side table showing her and Sir Gerald at a hospital opening. Both caught in earnest gestures. Miss Lane, though, she continued, was new. She asked me questions not about charity, but about legacy. That was unusual. And what did you tell her? Poirot asked. I told her that a legacy is as much what one hides as what one gives. The phrasing was casual, but there was a depth in it, an admission of strategy rather than philosophy. Poirot nodded. And yet, she sought the letter you kept. She wished to see the shape behind the generosity. You, perhaps, wished to keep certain shapes undefined. I keep them nuanced, she corrected. Nuance is what prevents crude judgment. But yes, she wished to see where the past irregularities had settled. She believed there was something that did not fit, and she was right about that. Only she was not right about what it revealed. From Mrs. Forsyth, Poirot turned to the quieter, less obvious thread, the connection between Lord Bertram and Sir Gerald. They had known each other through antiquarian circles, their conversations often about lineage, preservation, and the aesthetic of ownership. Poirot's approach there was slender. He did not ask directly about the clock or the letter. He asked instead about mutual acquaintances, mentors, and favors exchanged. You two have exchanged tokens over the years, Poirot observed one afternoon. Glancing at a small carved box Lord Bertram had once presented to Sir Gerald, which now sat in the library. Tokens are not given without memory. When one remembers, one protects. When one protects, one owes. Who, then, among you owes secrecy? Lord Bertram's lips tightened, and Sir Gerald's fingers drummed once on the arm of his chair. We owe one another decorum, Sir Gerald said. That is all. Decorums, Poirot murmured, are often the skeletons of the promises made behind them. One can dress respectability over deeper obligation. I will keep that question open. The next knot was smaller but revealing. Miss Eloise Mercer had, in her efforts to secure social order, developed an unexpected friendship with Mr. Latham. It began with her desire to ensure that messages and introductions were precise and grew, in her mind, into a form of quiet dependence. She valued his ability to make things happen without surface chaos. He valued her subtle endorsements, which rose him, in small increments in the world he inhabited. Poirot, with a casual mention of coordination, had them speak together briefly. "You are helpful to one another," Poirot remarked lightly, "and so the correction that failed affected you both. She was near the mechanism, and you were near the transmission of her request. In a word, you were both involved in the same rhythm." Miss Mercer blinked, then said, "I trust precision. Latham's errors are unusual. He does not—" She stopped. Mr. Latham shifted, uncomfortable under the spotlight. "He has helped me," she continued with a strained smoothness, "and I have spoken for him when necessary. That is the network. It is not, I did not direct him to delay. It was not my place, but I am aware of his burdens, and perhaps that is why I felt—" She trailed off, uncomfortable with phrasing that suggested patronage rather than partnership. Poirot allowed the awkwardness to sit between them. "Careful," he said softly. "When one feels burden, one sometimes carries more than is theirs to carry. The hidden weight can make one bend toward silence. Ask yourself, what does it cost to keep a secret when the keeping of it makes you complicit by comfort?" The layers continued to accumulate. A minor, almost familial acquaintance emerged between Miss Cressida Lane and a distant relation of Mrs. Forsyth, a young woman who had been quietly introduced earlier but had not yet spoken at length. She had admired Miss Lane's appetite for truth, and in private had confided that Cressida had been digging into genealogies, asking more pointed questions about the Albright line and its rumored unspoken entanglements with earlier benefactions, a breadcrumb trail that might have led into the very letter now missing. Poirot, when he recounted these connections to me afterward, did so not in the tone of accusation, but of diagram. "See how the threads cross," he said, spreading his hands. "A patron, an heirloom, a dependence, a curiosity about lineage, and a silence purchased by the removal of a letter. They are not random, they are intentional proximities. The murderer, if murder there is, works through these connections. They have placed people so that their story is softened by relationship. The difficulty is that we are too accustomed to giving people the benefit of what they appear to owe one another. We must instead look at what they gain when those owed become silent." Chapter 10. Poirot's secret clue. The evening's layers had settled into a careful tension. The false lead of negligence had been comfortably embraced by some. The secondary theft had drawn a thin veil over other possibilities, and the connections had become a web so intricate that even those within it felt the weight of implication without clarity. Poirot, beneath the polite surface of inquiry, had been silent in a different way, quiet not from absence of thought, but from the accumulation of something small and sharp that he had tucked behind his usual repose. It was while I accompanied him back to the room where Miss Lane's body had been, ostensibly to revisit the position of the watch and perfume bottle, that he stopped mid-step. He lifted his hand slightly, not as if pointing, but as if drawing the air toward a detail only he had perceived. I followed his gaze to the edge of the velvet screen shielding the private alcove, a narrow, darkened seam where the velvet met the polished floor. There, almost imperceptible, was a faint trace of a powdery residue, not the dust of the hotel, nor the ordinary flake of lint from clothing. It caught the lamplight in tiny, dull glints like the ghost of frost. "Hastings," Poirot said softly, "you see this? The others have looked and passed. They do not wish to see what does not shout. It is small and quiet. The little grey cells, however, hear the smallest sound." He squatted, his back as straight as always, and brought a small magnifying glass from his pocket, a habitual item, its handle worn by careful fingers. He examined the residue, then tapped the edge of the velvet, drawing a few particles onto a slip of paper he had produced from his inner pocket. He sealed it gently, as one preserves a whisper. "What is it?" I asked. "A powder," he murmured. "Not from the room. It is a compound used in the restoration of fine timepieces. Very rare, used to polish internal gears without harming the temper of the metal. There is, however, a secondary use. It is also used by those who wish to dull the scent of certain essences, to overlay and then soften. The perfume, Hastings, it was tampered with in 2 ways. 1, the fragrance was altered as distraction. 2, the same material used to soften and blend. The scent has been placed here, where a person might have touched to steady themselves or perhaps to mark a brief contact. The one who handled both the clock's hidden works and the bottle would have carried this powder faintly. It is not common among servants. It is not common among amateurs." He stood, closing his palm around the slip as one who now held a corner of a secret map. "The secret is this. The failure of the clock, the pause, was a stage. The theft of the letter was a companion to confuse. But the movement of the hand that adjusted the heart of the clock, and the hand that then, in quiet touch, softened the perfume, belongs to one who has both access and care. Access suggests familiarity, yes, but care suggests intention masked as inadvertence. The compound's presence here and near the mechanism implies a single hand that touched both. The question is not merely who could, but who had reason to touch both without the others noticing. That is the thread we shall pull. I supposed, as any man might, that he would announce it. He did not. He folded the information inward, carrying it as a private anchor. We shall pretend not to have seen it, he added, with a small smile that did not reach his eyes. Let the others proceed with their comfortable stories. The one who believes the first false lead is sufficient will relax. In that relaxation, they will show something. The powder is the joining of 2 worlds, the overt and the hidden. It is not the murder itself, perhaps, but it is the whisper that tells us the murderer has handled both the instrument of distraction and the medium of obfuscation. The difference between the 2 hands will be seen in the way their stories overlap. We now have a secret. We keep it like an advantage in a game of cards. We do not play it yet. He led me back to the library, while the others maintained their polite distance, their conversations forming a low, unknowing hum. You notice how the others speak of the clock and the letter as separate? They are happy to place them in different rooms of the mind. We now know a hand that touches both. The question is, which of the hands that appear innocent tonight is skilled enough and placed cleverly enough to have done so without the gesture being visible? That is the geography of intention. He did not allow me the time to press further. He had already started shaping the next steps within his mind, aligning that secret clue with the web of connections, letting the residue become a quiet lodestar. We wait, he said simply. The one who is the bridge between the apparent and the hidden will make a small movement. We shall see it because we are looking, not where the noise was made, but where the calm was preserved too carefully. Chapter 11. Tensions rise. The quiet collection of threads, each placed carefully by Poirot, began to strain under their own weight. The false lead had given some a sense of immediate order. The secondary theft introduced a skittering doubt beneath what had seemed settled. The connections, once soft and unspoken, now had sharper edges. The atmosphere, which had for a time held a polite suppression of fear, began to show fissures. Alliances shifted like cards slid on a table. No one overtly betrayed anyone, but small gestures carried significance. Miss Eloise Mercer arrived at the little salon with her smile a fraction too bright. She did not come alone. She was accompanied by Mr. Latham, his posture stiff with the residue of uncomfortable attention. She had, in the earlier questioning, spoken as if she were protecting a system she had helped build, but now her guard had subtly changed. She moved closer to Latham as if to cloak him, not in protecting him from accusation, but perhaps to own the narrative that had started to slip under her control. The story about negligence, she said softly, to those within earshot, including a curious Sir Gerald, is what happens when the small gears of society fail. We should not mistake delay for malice. We all have tasks. The important thing is how we respond. Mr. Latham has responded with honesty, and that is more than many can offer when they fear judgment. Her glance flicked toward Poirot, measuring. Isn't it better to have clarity than to let speculation swell? Poirot, sipping his tea, allowed the words to settle. Clarity, mademoiselle, is merely a well-polished surface. Beneath it, there may be dust. His tone was light, but there was a tiny pause before he lifted the cup. The implication was not lost on her. The surface is not the depth, and the depth is what he intended to see. Lord Bertram, who had grown increasingly silent in the past hours, began to circle his own uneasy territory. He had taken to speaking in veiled cautions, offering observations that seemed innocent but contained the slight edge of insinuation. In a conversation with Sir Gerald, he mentioned, almost offhandedly, when one relies on the reliability of a mechanism, one must remember that the hand that tends it affects its sound. A failure is not always a failure of the thing. Sometimes it is a message left by the one who wants the sound to change. Sir Gerald, who had been holding the comfort of his own influence, stiffened slightly. "You mean to suggest manipulation, Lord Bertram," he replied with a neutral tone that did not deny the implication. "I mean only," Bertram said, "that when the world bends to narrative, we should always ask who shaped the bend. The bending is not neutral." His eyes flicked toward Mrs. Forsyth as he said the last part, and her expression, cool as ever, did not waver, but the slightest tightening around the mouth revealed the recognition of the stroke. Mrs. Forsyth, meanwhile, began to make small strategic moves. She initiated a private conversation with Sir Gerald under the pretense of discussing future charitable events, and in the course of it touched upon the origin of certain donations, including those connected to the missing letter. "One cannot rebuild trust," she observed, "if one does not first admit that the foundation had a crack." We all choose to look away. Sir Gerald, who had been arranging his own narrative like the cut of a suit, responded with graceful deflection, but the conversation left a ripple. Her remark was, to someone else, casual. Yet to those who had been under Poirot's quiet illumination, it felt calibrated, a reminder of obligations and the weight of silence. Mr. Latham, feeling the increased pressure from every direction, tried to assert himself in small ways. He began to offer explanations for the delay beyond simple busyness, mentioning how he had been overwhelmed by multiple messages and how Miss Mercer had asked for certain changes that compounded his tasks. "I did not intend for anything to fall apart," he said, eyes flicking between the watching faces. "I believed that the systems we have in place would cover the small gaps. I did not see that the small gap would become a chasm." He was, in his attempt to emphasize his diligence, uncomfortably suggesting that the system was faultier than he had admitted earlier, a nuance that both weakened and complicated the neat theory that had settled around him. Sir Gerald, sensing that control was slipping, began to press subtly. He approached Lord Bertram with the implication that someone in their mutual circle had knowledge beyond what had been shared. "It is curious," he said softly, "how the two disruptions, the clock and the letter, have appeared almost simultaneously. Perhaps some of us are too eager to believe coincidence when there is design." Lord Bertram merely inclined his head in that cool fashion of his, but the conversation was heard, and Poirot, who had been listening from the outer threshold, did not intervene. He allowed the tension to rise, charting where each pressure point moved. There were alliances forming and dissolving, not by declaration, but by subtle avoidance. Mrs. Forsyth, who had once been in casual dialogue with both Sir Gerald and Lord Bertram, now found herself occasionally distanced from the others in manner. Her conversations with Sir Gerald ending with measured nods, her interactions with Lord Bertram short and polite. That the removal of the letter had touched her more than she let slip was becoming clearer. She had become aware that whatever was behind the theft put her at the convergence of several uncomfortable evidential streams. The underlying theme of all this quiet war was a shared discomfort with being seen in partial truth. People found it easier to occupy roles: host, patron, observer, steward. The cracks appeared when those roles overlapped with obligations unseen by others. "We are all actors," Mrs. Forsyth said once, to no one in particular but to a small circle that included Poirot, and yet some of us forget that the audience might also be the judge. Poirot simply nodded, his expression unreadable. But the words were noted. I watched him in this rising pressure, and I could see the secret clue, the one he carried like a silken thread, tugging at the fabric of the other's stories. He did not use it as accusation. Instead, he allowed the tensions to sharpen. The guilty, the near guilty, the connected and the innocent alike shifted, seeking new footholds. Each small adjustment told him more. He collected these little tremors as a man collects notes in a symphony, knowing that the discordant ones would, when arranged correctly, reveal the key. Chapter 12. The confrontation. Poirot's patience was a blade hidden beneath velvet. The tension that had been rising now had a place to focus, and he chose a moment when appearance and crack converged. A quiet afternoon in the drawing room, after the initial rush of speculation had ebbed, when the guests were left with their own uneasy reflections. He had called for Miss Eloise Mercer, ostensibly to revisit her earlier remarks about order and precision. The invitation, given with Poirot's customary civility, carried with it the weight of the scrutiny she had already begun to feel. She arrived composed, but something in her posture betrayed an internal recalibration. Her eyes flicked to the windows as if seeking an escape route, then settled on Poirot with a smile that was thinner than usual. She offered tea with the efficient grace of someone who had rehearsed the gesture. Poirot accepted calmly, setting the cup down without a tremor, and began. "Mademoiselle," he said, folding his hands, "you were generous earlier with your defense of Mr. Latham. You spoke of systems and burdens, yet you also share a subtle dependence. One supports the other, yes? That is not accusation. That is geography." He paused. "You spoke of time being a liar, and that the rhythm shows the heartbeat beneath. You also spoke of Miss Lane's fear about the correction revealing something hidden. You have knowledge of transmission, and yet you present yourself as merely the observer of it. Why?" Her fingers tightened around the teacup. "Because I value order," she replied, the words sharp-edged now. "Mr. Latham's delay was unfortunate, but it was not malicious. I protect the structure because it is the only thing that keeps everything from unraveling. Miss Lane was inquisitive. She asked about legacy, about influence. That is what one does in society. One asks. It does not mean one acts." Poirot inclined his head gently. "Ah, yes. One asks. And sometimes one is answered by silence, and sometimes by the removal of letters." He let the last statement float, allowing the unspoken connection to settle. "You know about the letter, mademoiselle. You know that it was taken, yet you have not mentioned it to the others. Why would one who admires order allow such an irregularity to remain quiet?" Her face paled imperceptibly, then regained color, a practiced recovery. "I heard only whispers. I have no claim to what Mrs. Forsyth keeps or hides. That is separate from the demonstration. I would not mingle them." Her eyes narrowed incrementally. "You are suggesting that silence is a weapon." "I am suggesting," Poirot replied softly, "that silence is a choice. The letter was removed, and that removal happened while others spoke of the pause in the clock." "You were close to Mr. Latham then, yes? You coordinate the transmissions. You ensure they are clean and arrive. You also wish to make sure that when someone speaks, the shape of their words reflects preservation, not disruption." Miss Lane's questions about legacy, about influence, were not merely idle. She sought what is usually hidden. Who, mademoiselle, has the ability to soften a scent and adjust a mechanism without drawing the obvious attention? You guarded the narrative by framing the delay as a simple error, and yet you know the weight of the hidden hand. That is not the behavior of one who only observes. She drew in a breath, very small, then spoke with controlled sharpness. You imply I interfered. I did nothing of the sort. I ensured communication, yes. I never touched the mechanics. I do not handle such things. I ask questions. I do not make the answers disappear. Poirot's small eyes, those windows to a calculation that never rushed, held hers. You do not handle the mechanics, but you are familiar enough with them to speak of their rhythm. You're careful in wording, mademoiselle, and yet the rhythm you describe is not that of a distant spectator. It is that of someone who has felt the vibration beneath. You defend Mr. Latham because you have a stake in the perception of his error. And you do not speak of the letter because its absence complicates the neat line you draw. That is the tension. Her hands trembled, barely. The movement was small, nearly invisible, but Poirot saw it. You believe the removal was meant to aid the acceptance of negligence, she hissed, voice low. You think the missing letter is a distraction. You play the game of layering confusion while those who would see the surface applaud the first answer. I play nothing, he said quietly. I observe. You believe the first answer will settle the matter, yes? That is why I speak to you now. The one who thought the net was already cast will breathe easier. That ease makes their next move visible. You sought to protect a pattern by drawing attention to a delay while not revealing the larger silence. That is not innocence. It is a defense. Defenses, like stories, sometimes unravel when tugged gently. She stood, the chair scraping softly. You have no proof, she said, but the edge in her voice had loosened, the control fraying just enough to leave doubt. No, Poirot agreed. I do not yet have the proof. I have the crack, mademoiselle. You have shown it by feeling its presence. I will see whether you attempt to mend it or whether you deepen it. We shall speak again. Perhaps you will enlighten me, if it pleases you, to whom Miss Lane's inquiries about influence were most pressing. Perhaps then the small movement will become a line. She left, the door closing with a soft click that echoed more than it should have. Poirot's gaze followed it for a moment, then slid to me. She is near a breaking point, Hastings. Not of guilt, perhaps, but of the tension between what she preserves and what she hides. The mistake she made is subtle. She revealed that silence can be used as both shield and sword. That gives us something. When the next pressure comes, we will see whether her hand moves to cover or to expose. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape. The web that Poirot had been weaving, thread by careful thread, began to tighten in such a way that one could feel its pull even without seeing its full pattern. It was in that pressure that the first real attempt at escape appeared. Not a dramatic flight on the public stage, but a quiet, furtive movement under the cover of shifting obligations. The kind that bears the smell of desperation more than of cowardice. It was the young footman, Thomas, who found it. He had been sent, earlier in the day, to deliver a small parcel to Mrs. Forsyth, an invitation for a charitable evening, and, on his return, had taken a roundabout path past the library. He saw a figure slipping from the corridor near Mrs. Forsyth's private sitting room, small, cautious, and holding something folded in a white cloth. The person moved with an intention to vanish into the servants' staircase. Thomas, who had been taught to observe the peculiar as precisely as the expected, followed at a distance, heart pounding, and saw the figure hesitate near the narrow service door to the outside. That hesitation was the moment Poirot had been waiting for, without knowing precisely what form the breaking would take. The figure turned, caught the light for a heartbeat. Miss Eloise Mercer. She was alone, lips pursed, eyes scanning the quiet hallway as if measuring the depth of her risk. In her hand was the small white bundle. She slipped it under her coat as Thomas cleared his throat softly. She froze. Thomas, steadying his voice, said, "Miss Mercer, forgive me, but I thought you might wish to know the time. Sir Gerald is asking for you." She started, colour rising faintly, and then, as if adjusting quickly to the device, smiled. "Thank you, Thomas. Yes, of course." She moved forward, but the bundle, shifting against her side, caught Thomas's attention. He had seen the way she had looked toward Mrs. Forsyth's sitting room earlier, and the movement, which should have been smooth, had a slight jitter, a tell of weight not intended to be carried so conspicuously. He reported with quiet urgency, "To Poirot." The detective, who had been in the conservatory with Lord Bertram discussing lineage in the most oblique terms, rose without comment. "Hastings," he said, and the words were soft, but carried the current of motion. "Come. A hand that believes the net is cast chooses the path that appears to leave no trace. We shall see if the trace is persistent." Poirot intercepted Miss Mercer in the small gallery leading toward the servants' area. He did not block her. He merely inclined slightly as if to offer assistance. "Mademoiselle," he said in a tone of mild concern, "you seem burdened. May I relieve you of that?" His hand gestured gently toward the coat under which the bundle was hidden. She stiffened, and the thin smile faltered. "It is nothing," she replied too quickly. "Just some papers I had meant to return to the archives. They are nothing to worry about." Poirot's gaze, small and precise, drifted over the slight bulge. It is the manner of the carrying that betrays the weight of intention. He did not press. He gave her time, and she, thinking herself unobserved in motive, moved to continue. Instead, he placed a hand lightly on the sleeve. "Perhaps you will accompany me for a moment, yes? To speak of responsibility. The little grey cells are uneasy when movement occurs in silence. It is better to speak openly when one has nothing to hide." She hesitated, and in that pause, the white bundle fell to the floor with a soft whisper against the polished stone. Poirot's hand, quicker than the surprised flicker of her eyes, closed over it. The cloth unfolded. Inside, the torn scrap from Mrs. Forsyth's desk, the small corner of paper that bore partial code impressions, and behind it, hidden, a tiny vial with a powder residue similar to that Poirot had found near the velvet screen. Her face turned a faint shade of ash, not yet pale, but drained of the practiced color she wore like armor. "I was going to return it," she said, voice low, barely a hand's breadth from breaking. "I found it in the corridor. I thought it better to keep it until I knew what to do." "You thought," Poirot murmured, "and in thought you moved. Mademoiselle, you underestimated the care with which silence is observed here. The scrap is important because it is the companion to the letter, evidence of its presence, and perhaps its purpose. The vial suggests the same hand that handled the mechanism, and the perfume is near its echo now. You are not escaping. You are attempting intervention." "That is interesting." She went very still, her hands curling slightly inward. "You have no proof that I—" "It is too early for proof," he agreed, "but it is not too early for the observation. You carry the remnants of a breaking that speaks of both intention and fear. You believe the first story, the negligence, was enough to keep the others asleep. In that belief you moved to secure what bothered you, and in securing it in silence, you became a movement to be seen." He turned, and with a lightness that made the surrounding hall sound like a stage, he called softly, "Hastings." I arrived, breath caught between curiosity and the knowledge that Poirot was holding a new pivot. "We shall speak in due time," Poirot continued to Miss Mercer. "For now, we keep the scrap. I think it was wise of you to bring it here. The one who took the letter is not yet aware that there is a second witness to its absence." She left without further protest, her steps measured but not yet composed. Once she was gone, Poirot unfolded the scrap completely, studying the partial impressions and turning to the tiny vial. "She intended to do something," he said to me. "To remove or to protect, perhaps both. The hand that carries guilt sometimes carries fear. That fear drives it to attempts at correction. The attempted escape, if that is what she believed it, was not for the sake of fleeing, but for the preservation of a narrative she feared would be compromised. The scrap is valuable. It tells us that the stolen letter had more than one eye upon it, and that those who fear exposure will act quietly, not loudly. We must now see who among them will move to silence this witness." Chapter 14. The final piece falls into place. The failed attempt to move the scrap and the vial had not been a flight. It had been an instinctive clutch at control. It had, however, given Poirot what he needed, a slight trembling aperture in the carefully arranged fabric. The attempted concealment of evidence was not the closing of a door, but the revealing of a draught. From that draught, all the air in the room shifted ever so gently, and Poirot, who had kept his secret clue like a small ember in his palm, now saw how the final pieces would settle. He gathered us in the library beneath the soft glow of a single shaded lamp. The others were not invited yet? That would come after the shape was clearer to him. He spread carefully the scraps. The powder sample sealed in its paper, the torn corner from Mrs. Forsyth's desk, and the pocket watch that had been found near Miss Lane, stopped dutifully at 12. He did not yet reveal the existence of the powder to any outside his immediate circle. The matter was internal, a private alignment of inconsistencies. "Hastings," he said, "the bridge has appeared." The one who handled the mechanism, softened the perfume, and sought to move the evidence is not the same as the one who caused the pause, but their stories overlap like a double reflection. The hesitation, seen in Miss Mercer's movement, was not simply guilt. It was the moment when the tension between preservation and exposure became too sharp to bear. She moved because she feared the narrative she protected would crumble. That fear required a scaffolding, someone to believe the first explanation, someone to push a second confusion in front, and the removal of a voice to give silence weight. The piece falls into place when we see the hands that touch both the obvious and the hidden. I leaned forward, trying to frame in words what was becoming clear in his mind. So the negligence, the letter's theft, the attempted quiet correction, all of it is part of a layered misdirection. The one who took the letter wanted a silence. The one who protected the silence tried to manage perception. Exactement. Poirot's fingers tapped the air just above the watch, not touching it. The note's vagueness, the removal of the letter, the change in scent. The powder, these are not random. They are a choreography. The one who placed the failure publicly, who loves spectacle, needed a secondary, quieter actor to hold the soft end of the deception. That actor is the one who believes herself a guardian of order. She moves to hide the second voice, not knowing that the first voice was meant to cover the hands that tug at both. We now see that the one who is calm in the center, who controls transmission and seems to protect the flow, is positioned to redirect attention, while another, more outward, creates the initial crack. He paused, letting the implications sit like fine dust settling in the corners. But the final piece is this: the letter's content. The removal was deliberate. The letter spoke of lineage, influence, and a promise. Thinly veiled, but enough for one wary to see its shape. The one who feared its exposure placed the first distraction, believing the failure would keep the others staring at the clock. The second, who manipulated the narrative of negligence and the silence of the missing letter, attempted to smooth the edges by attending to communication itself. The common thread is intention protected by proximity to both the mechanism and the narrative. The final piece is the alignment of motive and opportunity. Who benefits most if the truth of influence remains obscured, and who could both touch the mechanism and shape its interpretation? I nodded as the final shape was drawn. Mrs. Forsyth's involvement. She's aware of the removal, and her position places her between patronage and legacy. Sir Gerald wants the spectacle to succeed publicly, yet his concern with the foundation's crack makes him vulnerable if the letter reveals obligation. Lord Bertram observes, with philosophical distance, the bending of narrative, and Miss Mercer, she attempts to manage the perception, believing in the neat story, stepping in to cushion the wobble. The hand with the powder would be one that had access to the mechanism's inner workings, someone concerned not only with its public face, but with the private shaping of its resonance. Oui, Poirot's little grey eyes shone with a small fire. And so we must ask ourselves, who among them is both close enough to the correction's private sequence to carry the powder, and fluent enough in the arrangements of influence to have known what the letter could undo? The last piece is not a single fact, Hastings. It is the moment we see the intersection of the outward failure and the inward smoothing. The one who believes the net is cast takes the opportunity to protect its frame, and in doing so, reveals their own stake. We have a bridge between their stories. That bridge is the final piece. It is time to test it. He stood, folding the corners of the small paper as if sealing a confidence. We shall not yet bring them all together. First, we catch the subtle reaction. We will allow the comfortable conclusion to settle deeper. It will draw them back into their roles. Then, when the tension rises again, we will show the intersection. The final piece will not fall like a hammer. It will reveal itself like the last note in a chord, resolving the dissonance into a truth they cannot unhear. I sensed, in the quiet that followed, the inevitable shift. The game had progressed not by accusation, but by alignment. The actors believed themselves safe. Poirot had placed the piece and, with the ease of a skilled player who knows the next move, began to set the stage for the moment when the true pattern would be unmistakable. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. The hour had come when the pieces, once scattered like sand on a table, could no longer be ignored. Poirot sent quiet invitations. Not a summons for accusation, but a request to assemble. He chose the drawing room for its intimacy, not too public, yet spacious enough to hold the tension of expectation. He had arranged the chairs in a deliberate semicircle. No one was placed at the center, for the center would be occupied by the truth itself when it was spoken. Sir Gerald, Mrs. Ada Forsyth, Lord Bertram, Miss Eloise Mercer, Mr. Latham, and Superintendent Wilkes arrived, each carrying their composed expressions like armor. They assumed, with varying degrees of confidence, that the net was nearly closed. They did not yet see how the net had been rewoven beneath their feet. Poirot stood by the mantel, his small figure calm as a well-balanced scale. He allowed the silence to sit, not too long, just enough that the weight of the moment was felt, not filled. Then he began, not with accusation, but with architecture. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we have had a night of irregularities. A correction that failed, a young woman who feared it would reveal something, the disappearance of a letter, and the twisting of a narrative to hide voices. That is the story you have been telling yourselves. It is tidy, it is comforting, but it is incomplete." He turned slightly, just enough to let each of them feel the focus. "We are here to understand the true sequence, not to force it, but to allow it to become visible by contrast. We begin with what is obvious, and then we allow the quiet to speak." He motioned to Superintendent Wilkes. "You were quick to brand negligence as the first domino. Mr. Latham delayed, that is apparent. He felt guilt. He believed that guilt made him culpable. But you, monsieur," Poirot continued, addressing Latham with a small nod, "did not cause death. You caused uncertainty. That uncertainty was used as a cushion for another movement. You carried a message. You did not deliver it in time. That is something to be noted, but not to end the investigation upon." Wilkes, slightly deflated from the controlled challenge, inclined his head. Poirot moved then, as one who guides the audience by the light, to the second irregularity. Mrs. Forsyth, he said. "You lost a letter. It was removed quietly. That silence was meant to shift attention. You spoke of legacy and cracks. You are both concerned with how stories are perceived and how obligations appear. The letter contained influence, thinly veiled, and its absence made the surface easier to control." Mrs. Forsyth did not flinch. "It was taken," she said, "and I do not yet know by whom. Its removal complicates nothing for me, except that it shows someone is nervous about truth." "Ah," Poirot replied, "and nervousness invites movement. We will return to that soon." He turned then to Miss Mercer. "You, mademoiselle, defend structure, yes? You wish for order, and you believe that by framing delay as error, you protect the perception of continuity. You also prepared a cushion for that order by retrieving a piece, anticipating perhaps that the silence you wished preserved would be disturbed. You carried the scrap in the vial as if to mend, not to flee. The one who is too quick to secure the narrative is often the one who knows what would break it." Her eyes narrowed. "You speak in riddles," she said, her voice managed but thin. "I speak in the shape of truth," Poirot corrected gently. "Riddles are only for those who refuse to see clearly." He pivoted to Lord Bertram. "You observe the bending of narrative and warn about its makers. That is wise. You also withdrew when agitation began, choosing the comfort of philosophical distance rather than involvement. Withdrawal sometimes protects. Sometimes it hides a closer knowledge of where the bend is made. We shall remember that." There was a subtle shift then, a quiet settling like the last note before a chord resolves. Poirot took from his pocket the small sealed paper, the one containing the powder residue he had discovered, and placed it on the table so that it caught the light just enough for its presence to be acknowledged. "And now," he said, "the bridge. The one who touched the mechanism, who softened a scent to alter perception, and who then attempted to move the evidence. This is not the same hand as the one who set the first failure in motion. Yet their stories overlap. The one who believed the net already cast tried to protect it by adjusting the narrative quietly. That movement, Miss Mercer, was not an escape. It was an intervention born of fear." She bristled. "You have no proof that I did anything but act to keep the peace." "No," Poirot agreed, "not yet. But we see the movement. We see the intention to control how the silence is interpreted. And we see another layer, one of guiding attention. The true sequence, mes amis, is revealed when we consider who benefits if influence remains concealed, and who is positioned to both create a spectacle and shape its interpretation. The failed correction drew the eye. The missing letter softened the space. The intervention adjusted the story. The common thread is control, public and private." He let the words settle, then added, "There is someone who, under the guise of managing the flow, has made choices to ensure the outward failure became the main show, while the inward truth was softened and hidden. We have been looking at separate shadows. Tonight we will bring them together." He glanced at Sir Gerald, who had up to this point listened with a mixture of pride and unease. "Sir Gerald, you wished for success. You feared the blemish. You are the host of both spectacle and obligation. The question is not whether you desired a failure to be hidden, but who, in shaping its perception, moved the quiet pieces so that others would carry the blame." There, in that moment, the room rebalanced. The comfortable narrative was no longer enough. Poirot had placed before them the pattern, not in full, but enough that the missing spaces screamed with implication. The final gathering had begun. The reconstruction had opened the door. The next piece, when revealed, would not simply accuse. It would show the full sequence and force the truth into the light. Chapter 16. The Reveal. Poirot had built the architecture. Now he brought down the walls with the clarity of a man who has permitted the tangled threads to lay themselves flat and, with a quiet gesture, pointed out the subtle knots that held the whole thing together. The air, which had been taut with implication in the previous gathering, shifted. The moment was no longer about who might have done something. It was about who had arranged everything so that the doing would blend into what others were willing to believe. He began not with accusation, but with narrative. We have had failure, a public spectacle that did not perform as promised. We have had silence, a letter removed whose absence made conversation easier. We have had intervention, someone who, believing a first conclusion sufficient, attempted to preserve it by managing perception. We have had negligence, which provided a comfortable shadow. All of these were useful. None of them alone is the murder. They are the scaffolds by which the real movement was hidden. He turned to Mrs. Ada Forsyth. Her face remained composed, but there was the faintest tightening now, the kind of small contraction a trained observer sees when a practiced mask begins to show the edge of the seam. "You are a patron of legacies," Poirot continued. "You give, and you shape how the giving is seen. You also, monsieur, protect what you have built, especially when the scaffolding beneath it is rotten." Miss Cressida Lane had discovered something. She had asked questions about influence, about lineage, about the past irregularities that echo through the foundation of benevolence. She suspected, correctly, that the letter, which spoke in code of obligation and quiet coercion, might expose the origin of that benevolence as something conditional, something stained. That exposure would have shifted how others saw your generosity. You feared the revelation not because you were innocent of obligation, but because the obligation was built on a promise made in secret, one which, if scrutinized, would paint you not only as benefactor, but as co-conspirator in a narrative of control. Mrs. Forsyth's eyes, which had been cool and calculating, flicked briefly toward Sir Gerald and then to the portrait of ancestors still watching from painted frames. "She was going to show it," Poirot went on. "She had the curiosity, the access through small confidences, and the courage to dig. You used the failure of the clock as your stage. You did not cause the failure itself. You used it. You ensured that attention was caught by spectacle, that the eyes turned away from the quiet hand. You prepared a bottle, her perfume, with a slow-acting compound, masked with the same fine restoration powder used in the inner workings of the clock to soften scent and blur detection. You knew the effect, a gentle suffocation, unaccompanied by struggle, appearing as an oddity, a violet bloom of discoloration indicating the gradual lack of breath. You placed Miss Lane near the clock by supplying her with questions and curiosity about the irregularity, making her go to the place of spectacle, where the pause would serve as distraction. He paused, letting the assembled feel the weight of the pattern. When she collapsed, the letter she had been pursuing, one that would have undone the narrative that protected your influence, was taken. You removed it quietly to prevent further inspection. Then you sent the subtle signals, using Miss Eloise Mercer's investment in order and her proximity to information transmission, to arrange that Mr. Latham's delay seemed central, to give the first comfortable explanation. When you perceived that the silence around the letter might be endangered, you manipulated perception again by ensuring Miss Mercer would intervene, guarding the frame while appearing to secure the narrative's integrity. You believed the combination of spectacle, silence, and intervention would protect you. You underestimated the small clue, the powder, because you relied on how people would see the big picture and ignore the quiet touch that linked mechanism and scent, control and concealment. Mrs. Forsyth's composure cracked, just a hairline. "You have no proof," she said, voice low, deeply controlled. Poirot lifted the sealed paper with the residue. "This is a small thing, yes. A gentle dust used to soften. It was on the velvet near her, on the perfume, and only someone with both access to the inner workings of timepieces, through philanthropic restoration programs you funded, and the desire to dampen the scent that would betray the poison, could have arranged both. Miss Mercer carried the scrap because she believed the first story so completely she moved to protect it. That is why she was seen with it, not as the prime actor, but as a shield. The true motion, the one that set everything into alignment, began with you. Mrs. Forsyth drew in a breath, then released it. She would have destroyed everything, she said quietly. She was going to expose the origin of the trust funds, the conditional gifts. People would have questioned why a supposed charity was built on promises that had strings wrapped around them. I did not mean. Her voice faltered, just enough. You meant to protect what you had built by removing the threat, Poirot corrected gently. You did not directly press the fatal action. You used the perfume, knowing its effect, and the failure of the clock gave the pause during which her breath would leave without dramatic movement. You removed the letter because the letter would lead others deeper than the first explanation. You used those around you as pieces arranged to carry the noise while you handled the silence. That is the truth. The room was quiet enough to hear the soft tick of an unseen clock. Sir Gerald's face had gone a shade paler. Lord Bertram's eyes were narrowed, not in judgment, but in the cold calculation of someone who had seen the bending and now saw its architect. Miss Mercer, who had believed she was the guardian of order, now lowered her gaze. The tension of her earlier intervention had been nothing more than the flinching of someone caught in complicity. Her role illuminated, not as the origin, but the facilitator of calm. I accept responsibility, Mrs. Forsyth said, the words leaving her with a crispness that suggested she had measured the cost. I did not intend for her to die. I intended to divert, to silence, to protect. The revelation would have broken the trust, and in doing so, broken me. I thought if the letter disappeared and the failure occupied the room, there would be time to mend the shape. I did not know how fragile the pause was. Poirot nodded. The intention was protection wrapped in control. It killed. That is why we are here. The others played their parts, some knowingly, some awkwardly. The mistake was thinking that a series of small, manageable deceptions would not combine into a truth that could be seen when someone used their little grey cells to look at both the spectacle and the whisper. He turned to Miss Mercer. You were used because you believe in structure. You moved to adjust the narrative, not to harm. That is why you were seen with the scrap. You will explain to the others what you saw and why you acted, so that your part is clear. Mr. Latham's delay remains a regret. A failure of mechanics of communication, not the cause of death. Lord Bertram, you observed without interfering, and that will be noted. Sir Gerald, your desire for spectacle made a useful stage. Mrs. Forsyth, you will now face the consequence of the combination. Superintendent Wilkes, who had until then sat with a half-formed resolution, finally found the angle. You will come with me, Mrs. Forsyth, he said, voice firm. We will see how the law interprets intention and consequence. As Mrs. Forsyth was led away, her expression no longer guarded, Poirot turned again to the remaining group. The structure of truth, he mused softly, is not always loud. Sometimes it is built in quiet pieces, and only when one permits the small things to speak does the whole become clear. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The moment after confession was the quietest of the evening. Mrs. Ada Forsyth went with Superintendent Wilkes not in chains, but with the careful dignity of one who understands that the highest downfall is not spectacle, but the evaporation of control. The others remained in the drawing room like statues whose surfaces had been warmed and now were cooling, their expressions caught between relief and the new burden of implication. Poirot did not speak immediately. He allowed the silence to settle around each of them. Sir Gerald, whose polished public face now held a shadow of calculation. Lord Bertram, who had watched the shaping and unmasking with an almost reluctant acknowledgement. Miss Eloise Mercer, whose earlier intervention now made sense in a different light. Mr. Latham, still carrying the residue of guilt, but relieved that its object had shifted. And, resting in the background, the knowledge that the comfortable story had been replaced by a more complex truth. "You see," Poirot said at last, quietly, "it is never the single act that makes the crime complete. It is the network of choices around it." Mrs. Forsyth's intention was to protect a narrative of good works. The method, quiet, layered, and calculated, did not consider that the pause she created would be the very thing that made us hear the small sound beneath. She used others as scaffolds, and they, in their own ways, shaped the silence without knowing its source. That is the tragedy. The justice is that truth eventually arranges itself, so it cannot be hidden by prettiness. Miss Mercer, who had been standing with her hands folded, stepped forward. "Poirot," she said, voice controlled but softer, "I was wrong in how I tried to protect the frame. I believed the first explanation would hold. I did not wish harm. I only wished the instability to appear manageable. I will tell the others what I did and why. It is proper they understand." Her eyes flicked to Mr. Latham. "And I apologize for using you as part of the support. You did what you could. You were not the creator." Mr. Latham bowed his head. "I will make clearer the timeline," he said. "I will not hide how things felt. I am grateful that I am not the cause. That helps." There was a tremor in his voice that for once was not crushed by shame but softened by the settling of the real burden. Sir Gerald, who had been quiet until then, cleared his throat. "The spectacle was my hope," he began. "The trust I built was meant to reflect stability, not hypocrisy. Mrs. Forsyth was my partner in that meaning. I did not know the foundation had cracks deeper than I wished to see." He paused. "I will have to reconsider what I support in the shapes of promises I accept." It was not a confession, but a turning inward, the beginning of a fracture in the grand narrative he'd spent years polishing. Lord Bertram, with a slight incline of his head, added, "I observed. I did not intervene. That is my weakness. In the future, perhaps I will ask not only what is bent, but who is bending." His words were not accusation. They were a quiet self-judgment. He had been the one to measure the bend. Now he acknowledged that measurement without action can be complicity. Poirot, having listened, turned to me. "Hastings, the outcome arrives like a tide. Justice is not a single crest, but the water finding its level after the disturbance. Mrs. Forsyth will pay, in public and in private. The letter will be returned, perhaps redacted, perhaps used as witness. Miss Mercer will have to rebuild the trust she thought she preserved by managing perception. Sir Gerald will have to look at the foundations he proclaims. Lord Bertram will perhaps learn that the distance of observation is not always a virtue. And Mr. Latham, he may find in this clarification, not absolution, but understanding. That is the ripple of consequence." The authorities, having been informed of the confession's substantive elements, took the necessary steps. Mrs. Forsyth was not only escorted to a more private room to formalize her statement, but arrangements were quietly made to inform the relevant charitable boards that her influence would be under review. Her philanthropic name would not vanish. Few names ever do entirely, but the sheen of untarnished benevolence would crack, and from that crack would emerge questions. She had believed her control would keep the cracks hidden. The irony was that her attempt at smoothing the fracture had revealed the deepest fault. Before the group dispersed, Poirot asked that they remain a moment longer. He had one small, precise thing to do. "There is," he said, turning to Sir Gerald, "a choice now. One can continue with the narrative of damage and retreat into the comfort of scandal, or one can participate in the mending by allowing transparency. It will not erase what has happened, but it will shape the story the world tells. You, monsieur, will not be accused today. That is due to your ignorance and the lack of direct malice. But you are not without responsibility. It is yours to show whether the future is shaped by contrition or by continued preservation." Sir Gerald, to his credit, nodded. There was an unspoken agreement, if not yet fully formed. Miss Mercer, visibly unburdened by a clarity earned the hard way, offered a small, proper bow to Poirot. "You have shown me something I already sensed," she said. "I will not hide again." Poirot's expression was gentle. "The little grey cells see many things, mademoiselle. That is their blessing and their burden. The important thing is what we do with what we see." He turned, finally, to the remaining few and added, "People are not simply guilty or innocent. They are combinations of fear, hope, avoidance, and intention. Justice that only punishes overlooks that complexity. We have done more than punish. We have revealed. That is the beginning of consequence." As they left, the drawing room was left with its quiet echoes, no longer the brittle tension of uncertainty, but the heavy stillness that comes after a storm passes and the debris settles. Poirot remained by the mantel, his fingers steepled. "And now," he said to me, "the last movement awaits. The closing. For truth, when it is finally complete, must be given its final shape. We will see whether the human heart, which once bent to protect, can find a way to reconcile what has been broken with what remains." Chapter 18. The closing remark. The drawing room had the quiet of a place where voices no longer needed to speak loudly to be heard. The movement of people, the shifting of chairs, the soft scrape of a foot on polished wood, all were now gentle echoes of an evening that had been a complex choreography of intention, fear, and finally disclosure. The remaining few, Sir Gerald, Lord Bertram, Miss Eloise Mercer, Mr. Latham, and I, stood or sat in the softened light, not as triumphant victors, but as people who had been shaped by what they had seen and by what had been done. Poirot, with his small figure framed against the mantel and his moustaches perfectly in place, did not begin with a summary of facts. He let the silence gather like a well-tuned instrument waiting for the final note. Then, in that calm, he spoke, not with hauteur, but with his peculiar warmth, a combination of sharpness and compassion that made the truth both unavoidable and, in its way, instructive. "Mes amis," he said, "we have seen how the human heart constructs its own fortresses, some of stone, some of grace, some of kindness, and some of deception. The architecture of intention is not always visible from the outside. It takes little grey cells, yes, but also patience and a willingness to look where the light does not immediately fall." The affair was not simply the failure of a clock or the disappearance of a letter. It was a courtship of silence and spectacle, each trying to make the other more comfortable. He turned first to Miss Mercer. "You thought you protected order by cushioning the frame. You have discovered, perhaps painfully, that order without honesty is brittle. You acted not out of malice, but out of fear of the collapse of your carefully tended structure. That fear brought you close to concealment. Now you see, the strength of order is not in hiding the cracks, but in showing them and reinforcing what remains. That awareness is your redemption." She inclined her head. "I shall not misuse silence again," she replied simply. "I will speak clearly where I once adjusted shadows." "And you, Monsieur Latham," Poirot continued, "the weight you carried was heavy, yes, but you placed it in a wrong place. Delay is not guilt in the same way as intention. Your remorse is useful only if it guides clarity, not self-condemnation. You will help reconstruct the sequence, not to shift blame, but to ensure others do not hide behind it." "I will," he said. "I see now how easily things bend when one is afraid of appearing incompetent, and how that fear becomes a story that others believe." Poirot's gaze rested on Sir Gerald, the host whose desire for spectacle and impeccable public narrative had given opportunity to misdirection. "You believed in the power of appearances. Too much, perhaps. You did not know, or refused to see, that beneath the polished surface were quiet obligations that could stain. The choice now is yours. either to allow the story to be one of preservation without conscience, or to use transparency to reshape the legacy. The clock's failure was a pause. Let this moment be the beginning of the rhythm corrected, not hidden. Sir Gerald, for the first time that evening, looked at Poirot not as a curious outsider, but as a man bearing a mirror. "I will do what I can," he said. "It will not undo the past, but I can influence what follows." Lord Bertram, who had watched the bending and unmasking with that detached precision, lifted his head slightly. "I have learned," he remarked, "that observation without intervention is a kind of collusion. One can have distance and still extend a hand. I shall remember." Poirot's small smile appeared, not triumphant, but almost tender. He turned to me, and the familiar rhythm returned, the private cadence between detective and chronicler. "Hastings," he said, "you will write it as it was. It is good that the beginning of the end was not loud. The truth often arrives wrapped in quiet. It is the loudness of false confidence that hides its absence. We have given justice a shape that is not merely punishment. It is a correcting of balance. That, my friend, is the work of the little grey cells, not to destroy, but to illuminate." I, faithful as ever, took up my notebook with the feel of a man aware that the story would not be a tidy one. There were no grand celebrations, no easy erasures. Mrs. Forsyth's name would linger in philanthropic circles like a bruise under fine skin. She would face inquiry and re-evaluation, perhaps even the slow erosion of influence. Miss Mercer would rebuild, not by pretending nothing had shifted, but by speaking the truth of how she had shifted. Sir Gerald would face the uncomfortable work of examining the foundations of what he supported. Lord Bertram would watch more closely, and Mr. Latham would no longer carry the burden of imagined guilt alone. The ripple of consequence would spread, not violently, but irrevocably. Poirot, taking a small chocolate from a dish nearby, unwrapped it with the meticulous motion that always seemed symbolic. Order, pleasure, small ritual. He offered one to me. "It is finished," he said. "And yet not finished. People are like clocks. Even when the mechanism is understood, the time they hold continues. They will move forward. Our work is to remind them that time is not merely measured in ticks, but in choices made in the pauses." As we left the room, the night had deepened, the first light of dawn softening the edges of the city beyond the window. Poirot paused, his little figure silhouetted briefly, then turned to look back, not with bitterness, but with the calm assurance of a man who had seen the pattern resolved. "There are many stories, Hastings," he added, "but this one shows that the human mind, when confronted with its reflection, has a chance to change the frame. That is why I love the little grey cells. They do not simply solve, they remind." I closed my notebook. The affair had a name now. The case would be reported, and the narrative would spread outward like light through a prism, each facet revealing something new to those who looked. And for Hercule Poirot, there would be another quiet tea, another mystery awaiting, another human pattern to be carefully unpicked. For tonight, the truth had been served, precise, elegant, and, in its way, merciful.